Welcome back to Are You Smarter Than a Libertarian? Today we're going to dive into terrorism. After what's happened at Old Dominion University and what happened up in Michigan at the Jewish school up there. So we're going to dive into the numbers. So we'll be back right after this message. Let me start with a question. What if the loudest political arguments about terrorism are the least informed ones? Because while cable news panels argue and Twitter activists scream and don't really accomplish anything, the actual numbers tell a very, very different story. And these numbers didn't just get pulled out of my ass or from random blogs or partisan think tanks. They come from the people who are paid to track terrorism for a living. First one we're going to go with is Europol, the European version of Interpol. The Global Terrorism Index, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the New America Foundation. Some people may have a problem with that, but it's one of the sources I pulled from. In other words, these people's whole job is to literally count bombs, bullets, and body bags. And when you look at the data from these sources between 2020 and today, a strange pattern starts to emerge. The threat hasn't disappeared, but it also hasn't exploded. Instead, it's something far more complicated and nuanced, something far more uncomfortable for the political narratives on both sides, whether you're right or left. So, today we're going to do something radical. I know radical may seem a little extreme for this channel. We're going to take a look at the numbers because the numbers don't care how you feel about something. And then ask the one question that this show is built for. Are you smarter than a libertarian? And I hope once you see all this laid out, you'll be like, yeah, there's a more center approach we can handle this. So let's find out. First, let's look at Europe because most everything that comes to America comes from Europe first. According to Europol's Terrorism Situation and Trend Report, jihadist terrorism remains the most lethal category of terrorism in the European Union. But here's the twist. It's not large coordinated attacks anymore. It's mostly lone actors who have been radicalized. Since 2020, Europe has recorded roughly 68 jihadist attacks, including completed attacks, failed attempts, and plots stopped before they happen. That's where we get to 68 total. That might sound like a lot, but context matters. In 2020, there were around 57 total terror attacks across all ideologies in the EU. Only about 10% were jihadists. By 2022, that number dropped even further. Just 6 jihadist attacks that year. Then something changed. What was that something that changed? In 2023, the number rose to 14 plots and attacks. 5 actually happened. 9 were stopped before they could. Maybe it's people coming from third world countries not wanting to assimilate to the culture of the country they're coming into. Just a guess. 6 people were killed and 12 were injured. And in 2024, the number, it climbed again. 24 jihadist plots or attacks. Like, let's be real, that's a lot. Of those 24, 6 were completed. 18 were foiled, which is a good thing, right? We'd think that would be good. There were only 5 deaths, 18 injured, which that's pretty decent. Now here's the detail that really matters the most. 20 out of the 24 were lone actors, not organized cells, not foreign command centers, individuals, often radicalized online. Now there are going to be people that are going to call for censorship, which England already has. These radicals were very young. Europol reported that more than a third of jihadist terrorist arrests involved people under the age of 20. Wow, but there's a lot of young men coming into Europe. 62 were minors. Now let that sink in. Teenagers coming from another country are being radicalized within mosques. Radicalization through encrypted apps, gaming networks, and social media propaganda. Not in caves, not in training camps, on their phones. Now, people would be like, well, we need to censor phones to stop these attacks. No. And most of these attacks weren't sophisticated. They involved knives, vehicles, or homemade incendiary devices. The kind of weapons anyone can access. One of the deadliest examples happened in Schwerin, Germany, where an ISIS-claimed knife attack killed 3 people. So the European pattern is clear: more lone actors, more online radicalization, more plots stopped before they happened, and surprisingly, low overall deaths, which tells us something important. Counterterrorism intelligence in Europe is actually working. A lot of these attacks are being stopped, but the radicalization pipeline is still alive and well. Now, let's hop across the pond because the situation in the United States is very different. We are very different. According to CSIS and the New American Foundation, the U.S. has seen about 3 jihadist attacks or disrupted plots per year since 2020. 3. That's it. Since 2020, the U.S. has had 8 attacks and 10 disrupted plots tied to jihadist ideology. And that's a tiny number in a country of 330 million people. But again, the pattern, matters more than raw numbers. Almost every one of those cases involved homegrown extremists, not foreign operatives, not international networks. American citizens or residents inspired by online propaganda, which means a modern threat is not a coordinated invasion, it's ideological inspiration. A person alone with a weapon can do a lot of damage. And they also have a warped world view. The New Orleans attack on January 1st, 2025, an ISIS-inspired truck ramming killed 14 people. The deadliest jihadist attack in the United States since the Pulse nightclub shooting in 2016. But even that case followed the modern pattern. No foreign direction, no operational cells, just ideological inspiration. Then there's the case from Old Dominion that just happened recently. A man named Mohammed Balar Jalal walked into an ROTC classroom, confirmed it was a military program, shouted Allahu Akbar, and then opened fire. He killed a lieutenant colonel and injured 2 others before ROTC cadets tackled him and stopped the attack by beating him to death with their bare hands. Phenomenal. Here's the part that should make policymakers nervous. Jalal had previously been convicted for attempting to support ISIS in 2016. He served about 11 years. Then he was released in early 2024 after completing a drug rehabilitation program. 2 years later, he carried out a terrorist attack. That's called recidivism. And it highlights a challenge most politicians rarely talk about. When someone embraces extreme ideology, prison doesn't always ease it. Sometimes it just hits pause. And now let's zoom out and take a look at the big picture. Because when you combine the US and Europe, the data shows something very fascinating. According to the Global Terrorism Index 2025, terrorist incidents in Western countries doubled in 2024, but deaths remained relatively low. Why, you might ask? Because almost 93% of fatal attacks in the West over the past 5 years were carried out by lone actors, but they're trying to get political change. Lone actors are dangerous, but they're also less capable of mass casualty attacks than an organized network, which means the West is facing a persistent but limited threat. Not a wave now, unless you count the Muslims migrating into Europe as a wave, then yes, it is a wave. Not an apocalypse, a low-level ideological insurgency, and that is the dangerous part. It's an insurgency. You don't know who they are. Small, unpredictable, hard to detect early. That sounds a lot like kind of what was going on in the Middle East. But they're rarely catastrophic. Now, any loss of life is catastrophic. And that's a very uncomfortable reality for a lot of people because it doesn't fit neatly into political talking points. One side wants to pretend terrorism is everywhere, the other side wants to pretend it's basically gone. However, both are wrong according to the data. The real picture is more nuanced, as is most everything going on in politics. There's more nuance to it. It's boring, and more importantly, radicalization still exists, and it won't go away. Online propaganda still works, and it does. But large-scale coordinated jihadist terrorism in the West remains rare. It's like when a plane crashes, we freak out when they die, but 30,000 people die every year on the road. So yeah. The bigger challenge now isn't massive plots, it's individuals radicalized alone in the digital world, which is much harder to detect and much harder to prevent without trampling all of our civil liberties, which most jihadists want. Which this brings us to the libertarian question. How do you stop radicalization without building and expanding the surveillance state we already have in the West? How do you prevent violence without criminalizing ideas? How do you protect liberty and security at the same time? Because history teaches us something very, very important. Governments rarely waste a crisis. Look at 9/11, TSA, Department of Homeland Security. And every time terrorism spikes, politicians start reaching for more tools, such as more surveillance, more centralized power, and more control over your life. But here's the irony in all this. The data shows that traditional intelligence work is already stopping many attacks. Foiled plots in Europe often outnumber completed ones, as we saw in the data from Europol. Meaning prevention is happening, but it's happening quietly. We don't hear about the ones that get stopped, we only hear about the ones that are successful. Without turning society into a police state, we have to do this, which suggests something libertarians such as myself have been saying for years. Security does not require sacrificing freedom. It requires competence of the people doing the intelligence work. And maybe a little honesty about what the numbers actually say. Because fear is a powerful political weapon and both sides use it. But here's the thing, you know what overcomes fear? Facts. They're stronger than any fear you have. And if you want to understand the world instead of panic about it, you have to start with data. So next time someone tells you terrorism is either everywhere or nowhere, ask them this simple question. Have you actually looked at the numbers? Because people don't want to necessarily look at the numbers. Or are you just parroting a narrative like a good little drone? And that leads to the real question. Are you smarter than a libertarian or do you fall for the propaganda? Now, if you enjoyed this show, follow the show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio. Because every week we break down politics, economics, and history with one simple rule. Facts come first. Narrative comes second. And no excuses for bad thinking. As always, stay free, stay informed, stay accountable, and I'll see you all on Monday.